And we're back. Miss me? I miss me too. I know it's been a while since I've been here talking to you on the internet. Many of you probably wonder, where the hell did the old guy go? Well, quite frankly, sometimes I wonder where I went. Life is always... There we go, get some light. Ooh, get my pretty lights on here. Whee! Strobe light. Let's see if I get this going here. Okay, which one? Oh, there we go. There we go. That's better. We got the light. Anyway. Life's been crazy lately. It's been crazy for a lot of us, really, when you think about it. The fact is that of all the time I've lived and all the things I've done, the one thing that's always been true about everything is that, and this is the real big deal, I think, is everyone's out. We always hear about everyone wanting to win this or win that. You got the Americans talking about winning the war against Russia, and the Russians want to get a war against America, and the Chinese maybe get involved, etc., etc. But here's the real. This is the real truth of the matter. In war, as in life, nobody ever wins anything. And it comes to the axiom that basically has ruled most of my life. As there's no such thing as truly winning. Nobody wins anything. There are only degrees of losing. So here's the thing. If you think about this really, really hard, you realize that how right I am. Because think about it. When somebody says I won, what did they really win? Like, say, a board game, you won. Well, who cares? You won a board game. Congratulations. What does that get you? You're not making you any richer. Doesn't necessarily mean you're any smarter. You might be lucky. Who knows? But ultimately, what is winning really about? What is the purpose of declaring yourself a winner in anything? And where does that ultimately get you in terms of the big scheme of things that go on? And I think this all leads into something I've been thinking about a lot lately, really, really hard, is the concept of human beings and civilization. And where does it come? Where is it going? And what directions can it go to? Not just for my generation, but the generation of next, and so on. So anyway, in order to get that ball rolling really right, to make any sense of it all, really, the only way you can make it sense is to go back as far in the beginning as we can accurately remember, as far as history, as far as fairly reliable, not 100% reliable, but we can consider fairly reliable. Since the dawn of time, human life, as any life, has always struggled to be dominant, and found that the best structure, as we look in nature, is forming in packs, groups, because those become more sustainable against all your enemies. Working together is always better than working apart. Hence why civilizations all came about ultimately, or groups of what you would call civilizations. And in every civilization that exists, you have to have someone that is divine or the inspired force to lead that. So not just to lead it, but to help protect it against all other comers, whether it be within that group, other groups outside that particular civilization or collective, or just the general environment of life. So this is something that's been a prevalent theme throughout history. In the early days of history, ultimately, most leaders were fought by who was the strongest. Contests of strength were definitely things that were very important, not just for the sake of determining who was going to be the protector of the tribe, but who was ultimately going to get the access to the prized women. Because ultimately, the other thing about a tribe is not that you have to protect the tribe, but you have to continue, sustain it, and grow it. And ultimately, the best way to grow it is you want to grow it with the biggest, strongest, strongest, ultimate people or members of that tribe to guarantee its success. And weed out the weak and sick, and ones that are going to basically bring the civilization down. So ultimately, through all of history, strength in terms of physical strength has ultimately been the ultimate determiner of who runs the show. That always has been. And even in today, modern times, you can see that those same themes are continuing on today. So in order to understand how we got to where we are, we have to understand where we came from. And like I said, we understand the fact that ultimately early civilizations, the early tribes, the very more primitive ones, were basically the strongest was the one that was allowed to procreate. They had to control the best women, and whatever was left over, people got the leftovers. So, and those leftovers were usually divided amongst the ones that were loyal to the strongest force and that was going. So all the people were all the ones that weren't were basically cast aside, and their line just didn't continue. They were castigated out of existence ultimately. So we start there, and then ultimately we get to the times when, like, the more so like Rome and all these other things, where that basically you started having what was the early form of what would be potentially called governments. But these governments really weren't governments in terms of the form like we really know about, because before that we had the ultimate come of the early days, which was kingdoms. One person or one group or one whatever would ultimately win and defeat the enemies of the common people. And the reward for this win was they declared themselves the ruler and dominion, by God mostly, of this kingdom, and everyone else was a protector of them, and some would just choose to fight with them and get rewarded, as in the earlier civilizations. And the others would be the servant class that would serve and be at the service of this particular lord, and ultimately would have access to land, because obviously land was very important, because food was very important. And the ultimate tribute for the right to be able to use this land, or the protection, would be tribute in form of either taxation or giving a portion of your bounty to this lord, whose only job now is to protect you from everybody else that might want to come on and take over. That was the early attempts of government, and that's what we had. And the vestige of that particular system is the existence of kings and queens. They're the remnants of this very, very old monarchical emperor system. Most of them are figureheads of state, have given allowed to the civilization, into the common man, into the modern governance. Some still have some power, and then, of course, they're the ones that ultimately love the system so much they didn't want to give up this kingdom, whatever it is. And these are what we call the dictators. And they come in various forms. They come in ones that are form power through political means, but strong arming their enemies and intimidating the peasant class, the lower class, and gaining power through some sort of quasi-democratic or appearance of democratic election of some sort. Or you get people like, in cases like places like China, where there's no real opposition. Even in Russia, there's no opposition, and there's only one party. They're never elected. They decide amongst themselves. They decide within the ranks of the party themselves. Everyone's a member, and ultimately you have no choice but to be a member. And the closer you are to the membership, the closer to the loyalty, the more rewarded you are by the establishment. And then we have what are called parliamentary or democratic, have the name of the Republican democracies. They're the basic two democracy types that came out of the Enlightenment of all society eventually. Canada represents, because it's a vestige of the British Crown, the parliamentary type of democracy, and the Americans through the Revolution represent the Republican type, modeled over the Roman civilizations before they were similar to it. And as a result of that type of thing, both systems are very similar, but have distinctive differences. Of course, obviously in the American system, the leader of the country, the president, is elected as a separate member who is not as autonomous of the government, but is affiliated, usually in this case, to a political party, in this case either Democrat or Republican. And in the case of the Canadian system, you've got parliamentary democracy where the leader of the country is ultimately not an independent elected member, but a member elected as a representative of the state, chosen by his party to be the leader of his party, and hence the Prime Minister if his party takes power in the upper chamber, the lower chamber of the House of Commons. So these distinct differences make for interesting things. Like, for example, in the American system, there is no such thing as a minority government. The president is the executive of the government. He has certain powers over everything. And irrespective of whether the other houses in the government, either a majority or minority for his party, all it does, it doesn't necessarily bring the government down, but it determines exactly what things get done or what things don't get done, and what concessions that either party has to make, including the president sometimes, in order to get things done. Whereas in the Canadian system, the parliamentary system, since the leader of the party is the one that has the largest number of seats among all the parties, which allows the permutations of more than one party to exist, in this case more than two parties exist, which is what Democrats and Republicans represent in the States. Having a system like this means that you can get situations where they call what's called a minority government, where one or more parties of other oppositions might align with the largest party out there to give them a parliamentary majority by proxy. Here's the problem, okay? The fact is, with that type of system and all the members being elected that way, there is no true, in most cases, majority of each member elected in terms of representation. If you allow more than one person to run for a particular riding or location in the government, or a location in the government system, what happens is the ultimate outcomes, a lot of times, there'll be fractured votes. And those fractured votes lead to a lot of problems, because what happens is you get members elected that are literally don't represent the majority of the people. They represent the majority of the votes for their particular party. They get the more votes of all the parties that existed in there, but ultimately they do not represent the majority of the people in the area. They can't. Very rarely does it ever. So what happens ultimately, not only does the parties themselves represent a majority in the areas they represent, but the ultimate result is the particular whole system doesn't represent the majority views. Hence the types of things that happen in Canada and nations like that, like the British Parliament and other parliaments that form the same type of system with the same problem. And this is led because of the fact it's democratic, but is it truly democratic? It's not in the truest sense. It doesn't, and ultimately you get situations where you get people that are technically in the minority compared to the opposition ruling over the majority of the people. This is very problematic. Hence my thing. There's no such thing as winning, there's losing. Ultimately, it's a lose-lose system for everybody. The people that are running the system who claim power over everybody who are not representing the majority of the people, ultimately by the number of seats they hold, only by the proxy of a party that's technically an opposition party, don't represent the people, ultimately because the fact, getting back to the original point, those seats that were won, the majority of those seats on all sides were not won as the behest of the majority of the people in the areas that the people were running in. Therefore, right off the bat, we have a problem. How do we fix it? Well, one idea I had a long time ago that was really, really novel, I think, was the idea of having it that you have runoff elections, or have a second ballot, or have a multiple level ballot, kind of like what the Conservatives did with their leadership to streamline the process. You have your first choice, second choice, third choice, and fourth choice, all the way down to maybe every candidate. You can literally choose every candidate, but maybe you have a limited number of choices to make. And by doing this sort of system where you can call down the candidates by subtracting all the ones that didn't vote for either of the forerunners, and looking at what their second choices are, ultimately at some point in time you will probably come up with a system where you'll finally have, in most cases, the majority for each members. This will help to solve the issue of representation regionally. And it may also help to solve the problems of minority parliaments, because ultimately, if there's people that would have voted for somebody else that may have been closely linked to their values, then we would find that areas where there's fractured votes did end up not being so fractured. There may be a lot more acceptance and a lot more visibility to the government. But this leads to another problem, and this is an issue that's happened lately in our system. What if some other influence from somewhere else? We all know the one that I'm probably talking about. Most people do if you follow the news. Doesn't matter whether it's them or anyone else. A ultimate force has a vested interest in disrupting the democratic process in a particular nation for their own nefarious means, whether it be geopolitical stabilization or whatever. And ultimately, these people have a vested interest in making sure that one particular group has a better chance of representing. This is a problem that's happened through all of the times of elections from the history. Propaganda campaigns, spam campaigns, all these types of things, better deals, money laundering, money feeding through candidates, all this type of questions have been existing. The problem is, when you let the system police itself, it's ultimately going to protect itself. So ultimately, I don't think Trudeau, who this racketeer, whatever the hell he calls it, is ultimately going to be of any help to us. He's ultimately going to find himself absolved of any guilt, as he's already done. He's going to pretend that he's actually doing something right, and ultimately carry on until they need to finally gets to a point where they have to let them go. That they can't keep going. The facade of them supporting them, and the short term will have to drop, because at some point in time the people will, and their party will vote, and their followers will vote and say, hey, we've sorted up this point, but this is enough's enough. We can't continue doing this. Either you come in and take the majority if your ideas are actually more sound than the party in question, or you let the people decide ultimately what direction the country should be running in. So what do? We just sit back and wait, I guess. So what does that mean for the rest of us? Well, what that means for the rest of us, we have to basically live within the confines of the rules that we have, and protests when we don't like those rules, peacefully, of course. We can't let the other side ever make us resort to violent protests as a means, even if other groups have done so, and have successfully done so because the ideologies align with whoever's in charge. We can't let that be the basis of all we have to be better than the enemy. We got to be better than the opposite. We can't resort and stoop to the levels of the people that we hate just because they're getting away with it. Because ultimately that shows that we're not any better than them, and that we're not willing to set the standard. It's hard to be principled and set standards in life. It's sometimes very difficult because there's going to be people out there that are going to make it very difficult for you to be principled. They're going to make it absolutely impossible for you to stick to your principles, and are ultimately going to try to defeat you. But the fact is, as long as you stick with your principles, in the end, the people that are principled ultimately win the hearts and minds of people, as opposed to the ones that do things that basically discredit their principles in a way that makes them look less credible. So I guess it's the best way to do it is just keep fighting the fight the best way you can, and not let others tell you that it's pointless to continue fighting. And that's just how I live my life. I mean, my life has always been about the fact is, despite the odds, and as many times I've wanted to give up. And I know all of us have those times where we just figure that, hey, it's just way too much. That we only have one life. Whether you believe in reincarnation or spirits, ultimately this moral life you have, no matter what your belief system is, whether you believe there's some sort of afterlife or whatever, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, you only have this one life to live, and you have to live it the best you can, because there's a lot of things that are going to stop you from it. Like I said, it's not about winning. Life's never about winning. Life's about maintaining and doing the best you can to minimize any loss you have, including the ultimate end of your own life. That's the ultimate loss. Not necessary to you, because once you're gone, you don't know it. But ultimately, to the people that you have left behind, they love and care about you. They're the ultimate losers. They will have to eventually go on without you. That's a reality for all of us. Anyway, well, how can I end this? Well, let's end this on a more positive note, okay? Things might look bleak. There's always going to be times when things look bleak. But ultimately, the only thing you ever have control in your life is yourself and what you do. You cannot control other people. You can influence other people, but ultimately, the only person you have ultimate control over is yourself, and how you act. And not only how you act, but how you react to things. How you choose to react to things will reflect on how your world is, and how it's a positive, you do a little positive thing, or if you're going to be a negative influence. So keeping that in mind, start thinking more positive. Don't worry about the negative stuff. Negative stuff will go away. Ultimately, the thing is that the negative stuff will eventually lose steam, and will have to revent and be replaced by something more positive, because negative forces are hard to maintain. Good news is always, most people want good news, ultimately, except that in the news business, bad news sells and good news doesn't, because bad news is misfortune. People always talk about, they always like to look and say, well, at least I'm not them. We're always looking to compare ourselves to the people less fortunate than us. Isn't that kind of a really silly way of looking at the world? Being happy for other people's misfortune, being so caught up in it, and entertained by people that, or groups of people that have misfortune, just because we can then say it's not us at least. Well, I'd rather look at not the misfortune in life, because there's so much negative stuff going in life. There's always, ultimately, all of us are always going to lose something. Every day you lose a little day of your life. Every day you lose people you care about. Every day something is taken away from you and lost, but then there's other things given to you, like new life, new grandchildren, new great-grandchildren, ultimately new people coming in as old people come out. You accept that that's the way it is. We lose on one side, we win on the other side. Ultimately, life is only as good as you make it, and how you frame it. So ultimately, losing is part of life, yes, and ultimately we're all losing something all the time. But maybe what we don't think is winning. If we think from the point of view of losing, instead of looking at winning and worried about ultimately having to win all the time, just try to maintain what you've got, not lose it, and be thankful for what you got and be grateful for what you got, and never ever take anything you have in life for granted, especially the people who care. On that note, let's end this for this week, and hopefully I'll be back to regular weekly things here, because I know I've been very bad about that. I've got other things in my life that are going on. My health is obviously a factor that affects me quite a bit lately, and so. But ultimately, it's spring coming. Let's just think about the positive. It's spring. Spring is coming up. Nice weather. We're all going to get out there, enjoy life. We're going to come out of this winter, all its doldrums, and enjoy life for all its fullness. And don't worry about the negative shit, because there's always going to be negative shit. Just keep positive. It's hard sometimes, but we all have to do it. Anyway, on that note, I'd like you to go and like and comment, subscribe. Some people send me some comments. Subscribe to this podcast, and if you'd like to support this channel and maybe get it to go a little better, and you think that there's something interesting you contribute, whether monetarily or not, let me know. It's at info@endtimemedia.ca. And that goes Mike, and I'm signing off for now. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.